G'day and welcome back to Grease Garage, where we try to make things with wheels better. And the way we normally do that is by adding more power. And for all those people that think adding 200 horsepower to your mum's four-wheel drive is not a good idea, do not worry, we are not just a one-trick pony that you paid way too much money to see. We do all kinds of unnecessary modifications on this channel, so if you want to learn a new skill, then please come along for the ride. Now, last episode, I got underneath the Turbo V6 Pajero to make a custom stainless steel exhaust. And to finish off the episode, I showed a very bad quality video of the car running. Now in this episode, we actually do take the car for a test drive, but there's a couple of things that we need to finish off. So let's get on with the episode. As you see, it's a new day. I'm clean. That exhaust was a big effort, but we got it done. But before I went to bed last night, I made sure to take the exhaust manifold off. I cleaned up a couple of things on it and then recoated the manifold and the exhaust housing on the turbo, just so it's ready to go on the road. Another thing I did is I cleaned up the wiring down the bottom and I've covered that in heat shielding. I also covered the water lines, the oil lines, the oil flow and return lines to the oil cooler. Made sure it's all covered so nothing is going to get hot. That's the one more thing I have to do to the oil line is put some heat shrink on it, but yeah, it's all looking really good. Now, before I put the exhaust back on, I want to do the wiring to the power steering pump so I have a bit more room to do things, and that's what we're doing next. So we're going to be doing that step by step so you guys at home can follow along so you know it's getting done right. So let's get into that. So the first place to start with the wiring is the power wire. Pretty much this is 120 amp roughly, and that power steering pump uses on full steering lock between 75 to 80 amps. So first place you want to start is make sure that you have wiring that's going to be up for the job. We're going to use a 100 amp fuse by the battery side. So if anything happens on the line to it, that fuse will pop and it's going to save you some wiring. Next thing we're going to do is the earth, which is pretty much just grounding it, and then we'll go on to the small wires to get it actually operating. But first things first, let's chuck this on. Before I get on with installing some wire, I thought it might be a good idea to show you some of the parts that we will be using. And you should be able to get all of these from your local automotive store. Now I'm starting at the battery side, looking for a good place to put the fuse. You want it as close as possible to the battery side and in a non-pulling area that it's easy to access. So with wiring, it's extremely important to get the right tools for the right job. And in this instance, I'm using the Navara crimping tool because it does a great job and it hasn't let me down yet, doing your most common crimps without any issues. So after I've crimped the first section of wiring and knowing where the fuse is going to be placed, I run a length of wire out and try and get a rough idea where it's the best place to put the wire and the amount of slack I should have. In other words, you want the connection to be under no stress and allow for any movement. To protect the wire and prevent it from standing out too much, I'm covering it in good quality heat shrink. And where it goes near anything with an edge or anything that's going to give it rubbing issues, I'm using spiral wrap to ensure the wiring has the best chance to give the Pajero a long life of problem-free goodness. Once the wire is laid, I then go back to the fuse and tighten it down with the connections under the fuse to give it a good solid connection. So to keep the wiring clean, we have taken off the left hand side wheel guard plastics so we can run the wire from the engine bay
to the back of the power steering pump. Now I'm not just doing this for one wire, I will also be running other wires to the power steering pump and also later on the O2 sensor.
Okay, so now that we've run that power wire over the radiator, through the guard and back into the engine bay, we need to connect these two positives together. Now obviously we could just weld them together, but I want this to be removable, which means we need to put all of these on their own plugs. So I'm using one of these connectors and we're going to chop it in half and we're going to turn this into one connector for both ways. So let's get to that and see if we can make that work. So we're over at the bench because we are going to chop this connector up. So normally you might see these on the back of a car, and that car has them there for connecting up to appliances like maybe a camping fridge or a trailer with electric brakes, for example, anything like that. The reason why I'm chopping this up is because we could not find anything to connect that high of amperage together that wasn't just a straight connector. I can understand why, obviously it's a fair amount of amps, but I would have thought there would have been something out there that we could have used. So that means we're just going to have to make something. Now I'm going to use the Dremel, we're going to chop this in half, and hopefully this all works out.
So this goes without saying, pretty self-explanatory stuff, but what I'm doing is I'm chopping this in half so I can get them into two single pieces. And I'm very lucky because the way they've designed this allows you to cut them without affecting any strength within the plug. Once I'm done, to smooth down that plastic, I use a bit of sandpaper and then head over to the car to install them. So once I figure out where I'm going to run these wires, I'm going to do some housekeeping and clean up the rest of the wiring by using some heat shrink and installing a 3-pin connector, which will allow us to get ready for the next step, which is connecting the wires from underneath the dash and the alternator. Now as you can see, I have three 15 amp wires that I have installed near the key barrel. The yellow wire that is connected to the positive line, and that is directly from the battery and is always on. The red wire that gets power when the key/ignition barrel is in accessories, and the white and red wire both get power when the key barrel is set to the on position. Now doing this is going to save you so much time in the future. For example, this is good for turbo timers, trigger lines for relays for anything high powered like an aftermarket ECU, or low power gear like a boost controller or a two-way radio. But what we are using it for is to set up the gauges, a trigger wire for the power steering pump, and also a line for a boost control solenoid when Josh finally gets one. Of course, anything that has power needs fuses, and to keep it all clean, we are installing a mini fuse box with a 3-pin connector. So once I get these wires into the engine bay from the guard, I then connect the white wire off the ignition barrel to the black wire on the pump. So when the ignition barrel is in the on position, this trigger wire is activated by sending power to the pump. It gets the pump in a ready state. Next thing is to find power for the second trigger wire that will actually start the pump. Now, as I've stated before, you could connect an aftermarket ECU to trigger this, but my plan is to get this to be triggered off the alternator. So this is how I went about it. First thing is I've unplugged the 2-pin connector off the back of the alternator. It has 2 wires, and I found that the larger wire had power when the battery was connected. So what I then did is found a spot where I could tie into that thinner wire, and then I temporarily hooked it up, and then I gave it a test.
Now we got this thing working, the next step is to try and get this thing quiet again. So we need to get the turbo manifold, put that back onto that turbo, and then put the dump pipe and the exhaust on. So that's what we're doing right now.
Now I'm trying to get this manifold on in one piece, but I found it was just easier to take the rear housing off and just put it on afterwards. I've also added some copper silicone onto the turbo flange and the housing to make sure that we are going to get a good seal. Just remember, I put a very thin layer of silicone on, as too much silicone might mean it will protrude into the exhaust, and who wants silicone going through their turbo blades? Definitely not me. And another thing is, once it's all tightened up, we're going to start the engine up and blow up any crap and just see how everything is flowing.
Where you going, sir? The turbo's spinning.
Cool.
Cool. Fucking wrong, a bit rich.
A little bit. Well, as you can see, I'm back underneath the car, and what I'm dealing with at the moment is the wideband sensor wiring. As you can see, we've got a long lead here, and we need to tuck it up. So there's nothing there to actually attach it to, so what I'm gonna have to do is I'm gonna have to put some rivet inserts in, so we can put some P-clamps on this wiring, so we can set it up, and that way it's not gonna drag on anything and get damaged when Josh is out on the 4-drive track, or even just driving on the road. So that's what we're doing next, so let's get a drill and put in some of these ripserts.
So there is a better way of doing this, and that is with a threaded stud welding machine. Unfortunately, I don't have access to one, so this is the very next best thing. If you choose to do the same thing I'm doing, just remember to paint any bare metal and waterproof the inside. And now that's done, it's time to take the car out of this shed and go for a spin and make sure that we keep an eye out on the air-fuel ratios. Thank you guys for coming and watching, and enjoy the rest of the show.
Settle down, mate, settle down. What are you trying to do? Oh, you steak out.